My name's Chris Hunter, and I'm a laboratory manager for the UK Environment Agency. The area that I work in is known as the National Laboratory Service, so you'll see a mix of branding in the presentation between both the Environment Agency and the National Laboratory Service. You'll also notice from this slide title that I've actually got two jobs. I am a laboratory manager. That kind of takes up a lot of my time, so I look after an environmental testing laboratory for the Environment Agency, analysing solid samples. My second job, for which I get no more money, is the National Water Quality Instrumentation Service Manager. So I also look after teams of people that do field measurement and provide field instrumentation for the Environment Agency. So that's perhaps less relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, but I will come back and touch on that later in the presentation. A brief overview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I'll provide a brief overview of my organisation, just so there's a little bit of context there as to who I am and what I do. I'll talk a little bit about the UK environmental testing market too, because that's really a key for us, and I know that looking through the presentations today, it's been really interesting because I can see quite a heavy sort of food influence, so it's interesting for me to see that, but I hopefully present a bit of context there around the environmental stuff as well. One of the themes that really emerges from that is a real strong drive towards more for less. Customers essentially wanting better value out of their analysis, wanting more, faster analysis. And I'm going to look today using an example at the role of technology in that and how that helps us to deliver better value for customers. And then I will share some of my thoughts about the future, and that's probably a good time to just add in a slight disclaimer that what I am going to share today is entirely my own personal opinion and doesn't necessarily reflect that of the UK Environment Agency. The National Laboratory Service then is an environmental testing laboratory providing a range of chemical and microbiological testing to a wide range of customers. Having said that, the vast majority of work that we do is on behalf of the UK Environment Agency. Of that work, the vast majority of that is very standard, commoditised, routine environmental testing. The organisation turns over around £17 million per year and employs around 240 people. I wasn't going to spend too long talking about this, but I just wanted to provide a bit of background as to why people do environmental testing within the UK. Listed up there are some of the key drivers, some of the key pieces of legislation and directives that drive environmental testing. The thing that jumps out to there for me, again and again, every time I see this, is that people do environmental testing because they have to. Generally, organisations, particularly commercial organisations, are doing the testing, so the types of customers that are routinely using commercial testing laboratories are doing it because they have to. And that's an important point, because I think that colours sometimes the way that customers view testing laboratories and some of the service and cost issues that they might experience. For the laboratory, particularly at the moment, we kind of see two real areas driving innovation and R&D within the laboratory areas. The first is emerging new requirements. So a piece of legislation like the Water Framework Directive brings to the laboratory, via the customer, requirements for new technical products. The two main things that we see coming out of the Water Framework Directive is this requirement for new compounds, things that we haven't been routinely asked to look for before, as well as lower limits of detection. So things where we've got extensive experience in them, but actually we're now being asked to get 10, 100, 1,000 times lower than we were before. The second driver that we see very strongly from customers is this idea that customers want better value. Within the UK particularly, the environmental testing market is very heavily saturated with laboratory providers. There's a lot of spare capacity, and the products that customers routinely use are very commoditised. There's very little differentiation. Everybody holds ISO 17025 and MCerts accreditation. Everybody is able to offer the standard range of tests that most customers require, and there's a very low cost of change for customers in moving from one laboratory provider to another. That all drives customers to be very price sensitive, and that's a real strong theme. Whenever you're bidding for a piece of work, price is always a very dominant factor. increasing though, we are seeing service delivery increase in importance, and that's because there have been some historic instances of very poor service delivery from UK providers in the environmental testing field. And that's really something that customers are aware of and are now perhaps happy to pay a little bit more to make sure they get the results when they're expecting them. As I described at the beginning, I'm going to use a current example to illustrate this more for less challenge. So if you think about those two strands that I just showed you, we're going to pick up on this idea of more for less, because whatever industry you're in, I'm sure your customers do ask you to deliver better value, something quicker, something cheaper. We've worked with Thermo looking at the idea of using GC triple quad technology to replace some of our high-res sector instruments for dioxin analysis. So the work I'm going to talk about is using the Thermo TSQ Quantum XLS Ultra system, and this is very much a work in progress. So if anybody saw the title of my presentation, we're thinking, fantastic, we're going to get some really great answers here. I thought that when I started doing it, and all I did was create hundreds more questions. So unfortunately, you'll all leave with lots more questions, but hopefully at least having seen some of the data that we've produced. One of the challenges we find in using technology to deliver better value for customers, to deliver more for less, particularly when technology generally involves the analytical instrumentation, is, as we've seen in a couple of talks already today, the instrumentation costs as a portion of the direct cost of the whole analysis are relatively small. And that really therefore limits the impact that cheaper instrumentation can have on the overall cost of the analysis. If all you have is a cheaper piece of instrumentation, it has got relatively limited scope there for reducing the overall cost of the analysis. Where it does add value is where you can use that technology to allow you to remove particularly staff, consumable, chemical costs, so to refine your overall process. And that's what we've been looking at here. It's fortuitous for us, I suppose, timing-wise, that our sector instruments that we routinely use for dioxin analysis are reaching the end of their useful life. One of them is 14 years old, the other one's over 20 years old. So we're at a time anyway when we're looking to replace the instruments. It's a perfect opportunity for us to evaluate this triple quad technology and see whether it's suitable for our specific environmental dioxin application. Although I am going to talk primarily about dioxins and use that as the example to illustrate the point, I think it's worthwhile bearing in mind, and certainly for us, that we can see a lot of other applications within our laboratory for this. So for timing reasons, I'll focus on the dioxin examples, but that's not to say we're not looking forward to the stage when we can move this into the wider laboratory and look to realise some of these benefits. Being new to triple quad technology, so we've not got, prior to doing this work, we didn't have a unit in the laboratory at all, so we had no experience. We had some reservations around the technology and could foresee some potential issues, which fall into really three categories for us, I think. In terms of sensitivity, looking to replace a sector instrument, we were very sceptical about the capability of the triple quad technology to deliver the ultimate sensitivity to be able to see down to the levels that we needed to. We understood the idea that it's fantastic at removing matrix interference, so that's fantastically useful, but we did have concerns that we wouldn't be able to see down to the levels that were required. Also, we were unsure about the selectivity. It operates obviously in a very different mode of selectivity to a traditional magnetic sector instrument, and so we didn't really have a feel for how that was going to impact on our analysis. Finally, even if those first 2 points could be adequately addressed, the real challenge that I've identified already is for us to translate that into something that does add more value for the customer. So there are some areas there where, taking forward the technical innovation, we then need to transform it into something that does add value. Picking up on the first one of those areas then, sensitivity. So the first piece of work that we did was to try and evaluate the limit of detection that we would routinely expect to see on the triple quad instrumentation. We took a very simple approach and ran a series of dilutions of CS1 dioxin standard and then statistically determined the limit of detection. I present the equation used to determine the limit of detection, not because I'm about to explain at length why this is the best or most perfect way of calculating it, but I do recognise that this is perhaps different to the way that some people within the room would have calculated limit of detection in this case. This is very much a standard approach in the UK environmental testing market, And one of the things that's really relevant, and one of the things that had myself and Paul Silcock scratching our head a little bit when we were first using this as an approach, is that everywhere in the document, which I provided the reference to there, this is referred to as a limit of detection. For the rest of my presentation, I'm going to refer to it as a limit of detection. When you actually dig into the definition, it's really a limit of quantification. So it's just an important distinction to bear in mind, that I think, as we move forward. The thing I hate in presentations is when people put up big tables of data that you can't quite read, but I thought I would do that anyway, just to get my own back on all the ones that I've had to sit and look at. I think the real key points to look at here are this column here, the blue column, is our current method reporting limits for our standard environmental dioxin methodology using our magnetic sector instruments. Those of you using sector instruments are probably going to be sat there thinking, well, they're not really pushing the limits there, but those are the limits that we routinely operate to. So for us, before we could even consider the triple quad technology as a potential replacement or substitute for the sector technology, we really need to be seeing comfortably down to those levels and below. The columns of data represent subsequent dilutions of the CS1 solution from 2 times down to 10 times, and then calculations using the equation I showed on the previous slide of LOD. For those of you too far away to even see the numbers, the red boxes here represent the only examples on that sheet where these values are greater than what we're experiencing at the moment. So the real reason for presenting all of the data is it's very clear to see how you need to be running standards around your LOD to be able to do meaningful LOD assessments. Not knowing really what to expect in terms of sensitivity for the instrument, we chose those dilutions. Actually, looking at some of the data, I think we would do better running some higher level dilutions, more dilute samples, to help us determine the LOD for some of the later congeners, because some of these values are perhaps a little bit too high or way too far away from the potential LOD of the instrument. I've spent a long time, 17 years I think, doing environmental analysis, so I'm very familiar with the statistics, but I'm also quite an empirical person. So when I saw all that data, I went, that's brilliant, now can you show me some peaks, because they'll mean something to me. So all we've got here are the chromatographic peaks for the 2,378 substituted dioxin and furan isomers from the triple quad system. These are presented around the limit of detection calculated on the previous page. And as you can see, they're very distinct peaks. I think the most important thing for me was that the ion ratios obtained from the peaks are still well within specification. So if this was a real sample and I just identified those peaks, I would be quoting that data to customers. So that gave me some real reassurance that we were onto the right track in terms of instrument sensitivity. The second area that we looked at was the selectivity of the instrument. So here we recognise that it's using a different mode of selectivity to the magnetic sectors that we're used to, and therefore wanted to do some side-by-side comparison of real samples. So we took a selection of 22 samples from a variety of environmental matrices, selected, I suppose, fairly randomly, they were the ones we had in the lab at the time, and analysed them on both systems. We then looked to calculate the percentage differences between the two results, and that's what I wanted to present to you here today. Just before I move on, it's worthwhile flagging that one of the traps we kept falling into was assuming that the high-res data is correct and therefore any difference is a problem. I think one of the things this exercise has kind of really flushed out for us is this idea that when there are differences, we probably need to better understand them because it's a different mode of selectivity. The first approach I took to show you the data so I ended up with 22 sets of data showing for the 17 congeners the percentage difference in results, which looked like an absolute nightmare to present sort of in a nice visual way to people. So the first approach I took was I just averaged the percentage difference, if you like, and I'm conscious that I have called it a bias, but it's really just representing the potential difference between the two techniques. I averaged them all, put them into a table and thought that looks really good. Very, very good agreement. Bearing in mind this is from a single injection on each system, that agreement does look really good. And then I started to look at the data and thought, there's a potential issue there, isn't there? Because if I had two samples, one with 100% positive bias and one with 100% negative bias, and took an average, that would look really good. So the next thing I did was to take that same data and use error bars to represent the spread of results. And that starts to tell a slightly different story, that we are seeing in some sample matrices reasonably significant differences between the two technologies. I warned you that I would leave you with lots of questions and answers. In terms of selectivity, that's pretty much as far as we've got. So there's some further work for us to do there, because there's something in there that's telling us that we're going to get different results if we just start running our current methodology on the GC triple rather than on the sector instrument. So I think it's certainly done nothing to put us off from the technology, but it's where our next area of focus is, if you like, in taking this forward. The final area that I identified at the start that we wanted to look at was looking at efficiency, this idea of being able to use the technology to help us deliver more for less for the customers. Having done the previous work and getting our head around this idea of this different mode of selectivity, it got us thinking about some of the process that we employ and some of the cleanup steps that we use and whether there's any scope for eliminating or reducing any of those. One of the things that all of the dioxin analysts will be very familiar with is the idea of separating out your dioxins from your PCBs to avoid interferences prior to analysis. Given that we're using a different selectivity mode, we wondered whether that stage was still required. So we did a very simple experiment and took a high-level PCB standard containing a range of about 22 different congeners, analysed it on our standard dioxin methodology to see whether we saw any interfering peaks. Excuse me. We didn't see any interference on any of the 17 key dioxin isomers. So there was no ions on either channel, primary ion or qualifier, for the arising from the PCB standard. So that suggested to us it was a potential good area for us to look at. There were, however, some smaller peaks in the wider chromatogram, and environmental labs, probably unlike food labs, tend to quote total dioxin results as well, so there's potential there that does present us with an issue, and so I've identified another area there of further work. So these are the questions that it's left us with, I suppose. So we've had the instrument in for about 2 months. So what I've just described is, if you like, the culmination of around 2 months' worth of testing work. The things that we need to do next, I think, to take this forward, the sensitivity data we were amazed with. It really did exceed our expectations, and we were very pleased with the level of comfort it gave us. It's not that we were comparing it directly with the instrument. We could see that we potentially had an instrument that was providing more sensitivity in particular sample matrices than the sector instruments that we currently run at. The real worry for us is it's very easy to do that type of work with standards, which is what we've done. So the next piece of work for us around sensitivity is to repeat that exercise using some real sample matrices to ensure that we're still seeing that same level of data with that same level of confidence in more complex sample matrices. The second area that we're going to do further work on is this selectivity issue. We recognise now that we've seen differences in the testing we've done so far in selectivity between the sector and triple quad as techniques. We used a wide range of sample matrices with a very wide range of concentrations and level of contamination in there. So we've no real feel for which of these matrices we do see issues with, which don't, or where the potential differences arise from. So the sort of next area for us to work on is us looking towards, is this difference significant? Is it applicable in particular matrices? The final area around efficiency, again, we think warrants further work. So one of the things that we're very conscious of is when we did the PCB evaluation, we deliberately used a standard that we had in the fridge that contained 22 PCB congeners. Obviously, if you're looking for interferences, we need to be running an arrow claw there to check that other PCBs are not causing interference. And then we've got to make decisions around the suitability of the methodology, both for the 17 primary congeners, but also for the total dioxins that we're familiar with reporting. So there's an area of further work there. I think falling off of that on the back of the efficiency comment is that idea of we're now trying to work out what else we can use this for. So I think this idea of a different mode of selectivity has been really interesting for us in terms of it's not that it's better or worse than triple quad, than a sector instrument, but actually it's different, and can we use some of that difference to allow us to deliver better value? Finally, I said I'd talk a little bit about the future. And rather than look at the current approach to POPs analysis and take a little bit of a guess around what might be coming next, I thought I'd do it in a slightly different way and look towards the trends that we see in the wider environmental testing field within the UK, because there's some really interesting things there which might help us determine the way forward for POPs. we see this continued drive towards more for less, customers wanting more value. And we're seeing this increased emphasis on a more targeted or risk-based approach to monitoring. So instead of sending somebody to the same piece of river once a month, once a year, once a quarter, to take a sample, analyse it in the laboratory, taking a much more risk-based approach and directing that effort into areas where you suspect or know that you have actually got problems. We're also seeing this very big progression towards what we're calling high-resolution monitoring. Now, high-resolution monitoring, I would suspect, means something different to, as it did to me, pretty much everybody in this room compared to the context I'm going to use it in here. So high-resolution monitoring here, I'm referring to more basic, simpler inorganic parameters, the high-resolution being the increased frequency of data. So what we're seeing is that customers are wanting much higher quality data, not in terms of ultimate limit of detection or different species being detected, but in terms of the frequency of sampling data that's actually been provided, and that allows them to do much more. So finally, I've just got a little example to illustrate that. I did say at the beginning that I get to have 2 jobs and only get paid for one of them. My second job, looking after people that provide field instrumentation, is more relevant to this, but I do think it provides some food for thought for the POPs market. It's not the greatest graph in the world, but essentially what I've tried to represent here, I've got dates coming along the bottom, and we've sent somebody out to take 2 spot samples for temperature, DO, ammonia and chlorophyll. Very basic inorganic parameters. And so you send them out on week 1, they take some samples, you send them out on week 2, they take some more samples. So if you're wanting to identify trends, you can draw lines between them. And then if you did that over a long period of time, you could look and see the sort of trends of monitoring in the monitoring. The real drive we're seeing at the moment is that people want this high resolution monitoring. They want more data, more data frequency. And so we're increasingly installing fixed monitoring stations that take samples every 15 seconds. So if I now just overlay real monitoring data, live monitoring data if you like, you see all of the things that you're missing out by taking spot samples. Now, given the persistence of POPs and their stability, I'm not suggesting that 15-second sampling intervals for POPs is the way forward. I think it's an important model to represent because what this has provided is a real step change in the way that customers view environmental data. They're able to get so much more value for comparable cost, and it's fundamentally the change in the way that our customers are doing their environmental monitoring. So I suppose the real challenge for the people in this room, and particularly for the vendors, is what's the next thing for POPs analysis that's going to completely revolutionise the level of data quality that the customer gets. And that's me done, I think, if anybody has any questions.
Thanks for a great presentation, Bruce.
No problem.
Maybe I could suggest questions for Chris we take at the coffee break. We are running over a little bit. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, coffee's in the same place we had it yesterday. So if you make your way over and try to get back promptly if possible, please.